I remember that Halloween night with a clarity that still unsettles me. The air had the sharp chill of late October, and each breath came out as a pale cloud in the dark. The streets were mostly empty by the time I was heading home. The earlier rush of kids in costumes had long since faded into distant laughter. A few carved pumpkins glowed weakly on porches, their candles burning low, their smiles drooping like they were too tired to scare anyone anymore. The smell of burning leaves drifted from somewhere down the block, mixing with the faint, sweet scent of melted candy. It was the sort of night that should have felt ordinary for Halloween quiet, almost peaceful, yet it didn't. There was a weight in the silence, a sense that the entire street was listening. As I turned the corner past the old Miller house, I felt that weight sharpen. Everyone in our neighborhood knew that place. The Millers had left years ago, and the house had sat dark and forgotten ever since, its windows hidden behind drawn curtains. Kids used to dare each other to walk up to the porch at night, but even the bravest never lasted more than a few seconds. There was nothing especially gruesome about it, just an ordinary house with chipped paint and a sagging roof, but the emptiness made it wrong. That night, when I passed, I saw something in the upstairs window. A figure. It stood still behind the curtain and raised a hand in a slow, deliberate wave. I froze on the sidewalk. For a moment, I thought it had to be some kid playing a prank, but the way the hand moved calm, patient, made my stomach twist. I wanted to shout, to ask who it was, but the words caught in my throat. My breath sounded too loud in the hush of the street. Even the wind felt like it had stopped to listen. I looked down, pretending to study the jack-o'-lanterns on a nearby porch, but when I glanced back up, the figure was gone. The curtain swayed slightly, as though someone had just stepped away. My heart thudded so hard it felt like it echoed in my ears. Then the porch light below that window flickered, not a steady blink, like a loose bulb, but a short pattern, almost like a signal. I stood rooted at the gate, wanting to keep walking but unable to convince myself I hadn't just been singled out. The street lamp above barely reached the Miller yard, and the shadows under the porch seemed to thicken as I stared. I told myself it was just another Halloween trick, a teenager hiding up their butt. Something deeper in me whispered that I should keep moving. I finally tore my gaze away and forced my legs to move. Each step home sounded too sharp on the concrete, as if the night itself was listening. I kept glancing back over my shoulder, expecting to see the figure standing on the porch or at the gate. I didn't. The house remained still, dark, except for that faint, erratic flicker of the porch light. I convinced myself it was all in my head, just Halloween making shadows seem alive. But when I reached my own street and turned toward my yard, I felt the sensation of being watched again. I told myself to ignore it, that it was nothing but nerves. Yet my eyes drifted back to the Miller house. In the upper window, the curtain twitched, once just enough to let me see a sliver of the empty room behind it. I hurried inside, locked the door, and tried to laugh at myself. But the unease stuck with me. That night, I lay awake for hours, staring at my ceiling, every creak of the house making me flinch. The next afternoon, the memory of that slow wave still clung to me. I stood at my bedroom window, staring down the street toward the Miller house, almost hoping to see nothing so I could tell myself it had been a trick of the light. But the yard looked too still, too expectant. When dusk fell again, and the Halloween decorations up and down the street began to glow, I felt drawn toward that house against my better judgment. My friends had teased me earlier in the day, daring me to walk right up to the porch that night, and I'd laughed it off. But their words had planted a seed of stubborn curiosity. As I approached under the glow of the street lamp, I saw a single pumpkin sitting crookedly on the Miller porch. Its candle sputtered as though struggling to stay lit. The gate creaked as I brushed against it. The air felt heavier there, cooler somehow, and the shadows along the cracked sidewalk seemed to lean toward the house. I stopped just short of the porch, my pulse racing, and stared at the dark window above. For a long moment, nothing moved. Then the curtain shifted again, so slightly I might have missed it if I had blinked. A shape formed just behind the fabric, tall, narrow, still. I thought I saw two faint points of reflection, like eyes catching the streetlight. My mouth went dry. That moment stretched until it felt unbearable. I stepped back, then turned and walked quickly home, refusing to glance behind me again. But when I reached my driveway, I couldn't help it. I looked back one last time. The porch was empty, the window dark, but the pumpkin on the porch glowed with an odd, pulsing brightness, as though it had been watching all along. The next morning I tried to tell myself I'd imagined it. I even laughed about it with my friends, calling it just another neighborhood ghost story. But that night, as darkness settled in and the trick-or-treaters filled the street, I felt the pull again. I told myself it was just curiosity, nothing more. Yet part of me felt like I was being lured. It was later that evening, after most of the families had gone home, that I finally stepped outside again. The neighborhood had grown quiet, the laughter of children replaced by the dry whisper of leaves skittering across the pavement. As I passed my front yard, I noticed something that made me stop cold. We'd set up a simple scarecrow made of hay bales a few days earlier, but it wasn't there anymore. In its place was a strange figure still built from hay, but crouched low and posed as if pointing directly toward the street. The small pumpkin Weedy used as its head was tilted down just enough to look like it was staring. The sight of it made the back of my neck prickle. I stood frozen, staring, feeling the cold bite through my jacket. The street lamp overhead hummed and flickered, throwing the shadow of the figure long across the yard. I forced myself to step closer, my heart hammering, and crouched near the hay to examine it. It was arranged to carefully, arms and legs bent in precise angles, as though someone had taken their time, sculpting it into a human posture. The way it pointed toward the street made me shiver. I looked up quickly, scanning the road, but there was nothing there. No one. Just the empty asphalt stretching into darkness. When I looked back at the figure, the small pumpkin head seemed to have shifted slightly. I told myself it was the angle of the light. Still, I backed away, unable to shake the feeling that it wasn't just decoration anymore. That night I hardly slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the hay-stuffed figure crouched in my yard, pointing. I told myself it had to be a pranksome kid moving things around for a scare, but the unease wouldn't let go. Long after the streets grew silent, I got up and looked out the window again. The figure was still there in the faint glow of the street lamp. This time, I noticed something else. The line of its pointing arm didn't seem aimed at the street anymore. It was aimed upward, straight toward my window. I stood there, gripping the curtain so tightly my knuckles ached. The silence outside felt complete, as if the whole neighborhood were holding its breath. After a long minute, I forced myself to step away from the window, but I didn't sleep. I waited for dawn. The following evening, unable to stand not knowing, I went out again. The figure hadn't moved, but tucked beneath the hay where the hand touched the ground was a small scrap of paper. I bent down, my fingers trembling, and pulled it free. The paper was crinkled and damp from the night air. Scrawled across it in uneven, hurried letters were the words. You saw what was meant to stay hidden. I dropped it like it had burned me, and backed away. My pulse roared in my ears. Whoever had written that note had been in my yard, had stood close enough to leave it under the hay. I couldn't understand why or what they meant. I hurried back inside, locking the door behind me. But all through the night, I felt as though eyes were fixed on me from somewhere out in the dark. A year passed, but Halloween still carried that weight for me. The Miller house stayed empty, the windows covered, the yard overgrown. People said the city was going to tear it down, but nothing ever happened. By the time October returned, I had convinced myself it had all been some elaborate prank, until the night before Halloween, when my friend Ryan came over. We were both 16 by then, old enough to think we were brave, young enough to still want the thrill of a scare. We'd grown up hearing stories about the Miller place and the even older greenhouse across the street from my house, a sagging structure with peeling green paint that locals swore was haunted. Ryan, reckless as always, dared me to go with him to check the place out. I didn't want to, not really, but there was that same pull I'd felt before. We grabbed our flashlights and crossed the street. The neighborhood was quiet, the last of the trick-or-treaters long gone. The greenhouse loomed at the end of the block, darker than the rest of the houses, its windows half covered with torn curtains. The gate to the backyard was ajar, swinging slowly as if stirred by more than the wind. We stepped inside. The air felt heavier there. The smell of damp earth and rotting leaves thickened the stillness. In the back corner, near the fence, my flashlight caught a shape half hidden in the weeds. For a moment I thought it was just a bundle of fabric. Then it shifted slightly. The light caught the pale oval of a mask racked, with a long hollow mouth and stitched edges. Ryan muttered something under his breath, but we both froze. The figure crouched low in the grass, wearing tattered orange and black fabric that might once have been a costume. It didn't move at first, but when I whispered a shaky hello, it slowly tilted its head, as though curious. My stomach dropped. There was something about the way it breathed slow, rasping, deliberate that made every instinct in me scream to run. We began backing toward the gate, not daring to turn our backs. The figure stayed still, its head tilted just slightly as if watching. We had almost reached the gate when Ryan glanced back. The figure was gone. The spot where it had crouched was just a patch of damp grass. We bolted across the street, slamming my front door shut behind us. Ryan tried to laugh it off as a Halloween prank, but the way his hands trembled gave him away. That night, long after Ryan had gone home, I sat at my bedroom window again. The greenhouse yard was still, nothing but the occasional sway of the branches. I almost convinced myself it had been our imaginations, until I saw a faint glint near the back fence, like light reflecting off glass. I leaned closer and for a split second saw the cracked mask peering through the slats of the fence before it slipped back into the dark. Halloween night came, and the street filled with children in costumes again. But when the crowds thinned and the houses went dark, I saw something new. A single pumpkin sitting on my own front lawn. It wasn't one of ours. It had a jagged grin carved into it not neatly with a knife, but scraped and torn as though by claws. I found muddy footprints in the morning, leading from the sidewalk to the space beneath my bedroom window. Ryan came by later, pale and quiet. He said he'd heard footsteps circling his own house the night before. We both knew, without saying it out loud, that it had to be connected to what we'd seen. That evening, just as the last trick-or-treaters disappeared down the street, we crossed to the greenhouse again. The gate creaked in the cold wind as we stepped into the yard, near the back fence. In the spot where we had seen the figure crouched, someone had arranged hay into a rough circle, and in the center lay the cracked white mask. Ryan bent down to pick it up. The moment he lifted it, a soft scrape sounded behind us, something shifting on the porch steps. We spun around. The front door of the house, which had been shut when we entered the yard, was now open a few inches. Beyond the gap was nothing but darkness. We stood frozen, hardly breathing, until a faint orange glow flickered inside like candlelight. Then came the slow, heavy sound of footsteps crossing the wooden floor toward the door. They stopped just behind it. The door creaked wider. In the dim light, we saw the same figure, the orange and black costume hanging loose on its frame, the cracked mask staring out at us. In its hand it held something long and thin, dragging it across the floorboards with a soft rasping sound. We didn't wait to see more. We ran. I don't remember how we got back to my house. Only the pounding of my heart and the certainty that something was just a few steps behind us. When we finally slammed the door shut and locked it, Ryan's hands shook so badly he could barely hold his phone. By the time he managed to call the police, the figure was gone. The officers found nothing inside the greenhouse. No footprints, no forced entry, just the mask lying on the porch steps as if it had been left there for us to find. The house was eventually boarded up. A for sale sign planted in the front yard. But a few nights ago, as October crept close again, I saw something that made my stomach knot. A single pumpkin sat on the porch, carved into a jagged grin that looked exactly like the one that had been left in my yard that first night. When I told Ryan, he didn't laugh. We just stood across the street, staring at the dark house, saying nothing. Sometimes now, on quiet nights, I pass by and glance at the upper window of the old Miller place or the slats of the greenhouse fence. I tell myself there's nothing there. But every so often I feel that prickle on the back of my neck, the certainty of eyes watching from the dark.